This week we're going to be walking through a Docker installation of DB2 version 11.1 from soup to nuts. From going out and finding it in the Docker store to pulling it down, running it, executing it, making changes, and then saving what we've done. For you to do this with me, there are a couple of assumptions. One, that you have Docker installed. Two, that we are speaking some of the same language with concepts and terminology. If you haven't yet and you are brand new to this, you want to watch the video just previous to this one where I start talking about Docker at a 40,000 foot view, as well as some basic commands and image and container manipulation. But if you've watched that and you're ready to go, I can show you the walkthrough from beginning to end. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we even discuss how we install an image in Docker, we need to talk about the two types of repositories, especially since it can get confusing because IBM has its hands in both, or did have their hands in both. The first is the Docker Hub, and the second is the Docker Store. The Docker Hub is basically a generic GitHub-like repository where anybody from a business to just a normal schmuck like me can actually keep an image for anybody to get. And the Docker Store is a more formal ecosystem that is for businesses. It's more tightly controlled, and you can actually be charged for your images here. I want to show you what is in both so you can compare and download. The first, let's go to Docker Hub. If you just type DB2 and hit enter, you're going to see a list of repositories that have some sort of image in it. These are all different people with different types of installs, as well as how high they are rated and how many times they've been pulled down. The very top one is IBM. So if we click on this, you will see that it was last published 2 years ago. So IBM has Express C here. It's 10.5, I believe. However, they haven't been keeping their hands on it because it looks like they've converted over to the Docker Store and they've thrown everything into Developer C. So can you still get Express C here? Yes, you can. And it will tell you exactly the command you need to pull it down, as well as what you need to do to start getting it to run. Everything here is pretty well laid out and it's very simple to run. Running it over from the Docker Store, Developer C is a little bit more complicated because it's 10 times more robust. It can do a lot of pre-configured situations for you. Do you want to have Blue up and running? Do you want to automatically create a sample database? Do you want to configure for HADR? The image here on the Docker Store is 10 times more dynamic, so there's a few extra steps other than just a simple pull. So let's look here for DB2. These are all by IBM. Notice there aren't any normal schmucks like me with anything up here. And there are all sorts of variations of images you can get, but we're going to take a look at the Developer C edition. When you go here, it'll give you a high-level overview of what's going on, but you want to actually see the setup instructions. The setup instructions are going to guide you through step by step what needs to be done. This is what we are going to follow here. The first thing it's going to do is give you the command you need to cut and paste to initiate the connection to this repository and pull down the image. But it's also going to cover the prerequisites that you need. It's going to tell you how to log in, which is different than the Docker Hub that we just saw. And it'll give you a way of pre-establishing what you want. Do you want a database setup? Do you want Blue? Is this for a Mac? Do you want HADR? It'll say, tell me what these switches are, and I'll go ahead and get it up and running so you don't have to. This is what we're going to go ahead and get started with at the command line. One last thing before we go. The Docker Store you must have an ID for because you have to log in to pick out the image you want. The Docker Hub you don't necessarily have to have ID. I do have one. It makes things easier. They're free to create on either side, so I highly recommend that you grab it. But let's take what we've learned here and go ahead and put it over to the command line. So we're going to go ahead and start trying to bring the image down and create a container via command line. Now I am going to be bouncing around a lot. Instead of just staying within the web page trying to copy and paste things, I actually move things over to be more streamlined to a text document where I'm going to cut and paste. So I'm going to be bouncing between my web browser, my notepad, and my command line back and forth. I'm hoping you're able to follow and that the increased font size will make it easier for you to see. So the first thing is, here are our instructions, and they look really complicated, but they're not bad. It essentially comes down to log in, pull the image, create an environment file, and run. So what I've done is I've taken these commands and I have created a document with step-by-step of what we're going to do. And I've gone in and I went ahead and swapped out some of the variables that we needed to put in play. So let's go ahead and start with the real basic and go over to the Docker login. So here's my main screen. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger for you. There we go. And let's look at what we have now. So if I do Docker image list, right now all I have is an image of Express C. Now I want to see, do I have any containers launched? Did I use that image to spin something up to go play with? So Docker container list. Nope. Well, maybe it's inactive. Docker ps -a. No, nothing's there. So let's go ahead and pull the image down from the Docker store. So I'm going to type Docker login, if I can spell. And it's my ID is mgraphic, we know that. And my password, which I think I know, in. Alright, so we now have our connection over to the Docker store. The next thing is to go ahead and pull the Docker image. Now this is actually going to take a second because I have to download it. But to show you where I got that command, if you are on the main page, it's the first thing you see at the top right hand corner. And it also talks about it here at the step here about pulling the right image. So let's go over and say get the image and bring it down locally. This is going to take a second, so I may end up fading in and out instead of making you wait. So we've downloaded. Let's make sure the image is there. Docker image list. Ah, good. Now I have my Express C image and my Developer C image. However, I have not spun anything up yet. And I'm going to show you what we're supposed to do there. I'm going to go over to my text document. And this is what we do to spin up a container. I've gone through and I've already swapped out some of the variables here, and I want to explain what they are. So for example, in the instructions it says run -h db2 server _ container name. I was really confused what they meant by container name. What they meant is, what do you want to name the VM that spins up? You have to give a machine name. You have to pass it on. So when I open it up and I log in, that machine has a name. That's got to be what goes into the db2 node CFG file that says I exist on this host. So in this case, I'm basically saying when you spin up, name the computer, name the server, this. Then I'm going to go through and I'm going to say give this container an actual name. How am I going to refer to it? I want to call it db2 server. I don't want to have to get some randomly generated name that it's going to give you. I want you to detach from it, which means go ahead and spin this up and leave it running in the background. I'll come back. Privileged is giving special access to the OS that is needed for db2. Then P is for the port. The env file is specific to this set of directions, and it's what allows you to go and say I want this on, this off, and configure it this way. Finally, we have the -v, which is saying map this file system on my local as a file system over on the container you're spinning up. And then finally, give it a name. What are you going to call this image? And so you can end up basically giving it the repository and a tag or whatever you want to call it here. Now I want to go and cover this, the env file. One of the things they want you to go do, and let's make sure where I am. I'm in the file system on my local that I want to launch this container from. And I have a bunch of different things in here. But if you noticed, I don't have that env.list. And if you're not env_list, and if you're not used to dealing with Linux, this is a little confusing. That's because it's a hidden file. So if I do ls-la instead of L, it's going to show the env list, which I've already gone through and made some adjustments. I did a couple things. For example, I said, go ahead and create a sample database for me. And oh yeah, by the way, I am on a Mac, so let's make it true. I've gone and done a couple of the basic things that's needed, including setting a password and accepting the licensing agreement. So we've got the image down. We've got our env_list that's created. Let's go ahead and spin up the container. I ended up taking all this information here and just running it into one big line because it's easier for me to follow when I cut and paste it. So I've got it. Here's the command that says go get the image and spin up a container. Let's see what happens. Perfect. It's done. So we have the Docker image list. Here are our images, and then we have Docker container list. There's our new container. It'll tell you the port, how long it's been up, what you're naming it, the container ID. It's word wrapping poorly here because I have such a large font, but you can get a lot of information for this. The one thing I want to point out here for later on, in case you forget, is container list only shows you what's active. If you have containers that are stopped, it won't show up unless you do a docker ps-a. It'll give you the same thing, but it'll also show you what's inactive. So it's up and running. That's fantastic. One thing that I want to point out is that sometimes it takes a while for the spin up to happen. And I ran into this problem a few times. It was up, it was running. I went, fine, let me go in there, and I start throwing commands, and I was getting all sorts of errors. That's because once you say spin up the container, it may have a bunch of steps to do after the fact. So it's telling you that the container's there and that it's active. But what it's not telling you is, hey, I may still be doing stuff in the background. So if you immediately fly in there and throw commands, you may be getting errors. So I do a few things that I'll take a look. First, I want to make sure that the container created without a problem. So I'm going to look at the container's logs. So if I do docker logs, and then I give it the container ID, it'll tell me everything it did when it spun that thing up. And you can see what's going on in the background. Hey, I've got to mess around with services. I'm going to go ahead and create a new database, start things up. We know everything here is pretty much normal. So let's actually go into the container. That command's easy, and I'll explain it here. So docker execute to the terminal, make it interactive, call this container, remember we named it Db2 server up here, bash, and then switch over into Db2 inst1. So let's see if that works. Ooh, there we go. So I'm going to go check the Db2 error log to make sure it's not just scrolling by still. Remember, the error log is going to give you informational messages as well. So I just happen to know that the default's going to be in cd SQL SQL lib. It's going to be in db2 dump. And then it was in diag. And here's my diag log. So I'm going to highlight it. And I'm going to say tail-f diag log. That's going to give me the last 10 lines or so. The F means keep scrolling if things are actively being done. So don't panic here because it's a severe error. It's just complaining about the port, but it's actually still going to work. It's not scrolling by anymore, which makes me think it's not going through and updating the dbcfg or the db2 set or starting or stopping. Things should relatively be safe now. So I'm going to break out of this. Go back to a main directory. And I'm going to make sure everything looks okay. So db2 list database directory. There we go. It created a test database for me where it's just a shell. There's nothing there. But more importantly, it created sample, which is what I like to go play with. So let me make sure I can connect to it. db2 connect. Well, why don't we activate it? Activate database sample. Hey, it worked. So everything did end and we were able to move on. This is the basics to get you going. I'm going to show you a few other things real quick, like can I create two connections or what happens if I make changes. But this is the basics you needed to get started. But let me show you a few other things. So you remember what we said before. We mounted a local file system to this container under database. So I'm going to go to database. I have some scripts here that set things up as I like them when I normally start up a brand new environment. Matter of fact, let me show you. If you go to my GitHub account and go to the Discover DB2, let me go bigger, the Discover DB2 page. Well, first of all, I've got a ton of stuff here. Things that I use every day, from utility scripts to triaging, monitoring, whatever. I have a bunch of repositories. But if you go to the Discover DB2 repository, if I have ever used a script in any of my episodes, they're going to be here. And there is a 3-part episode where I set up a brand new environment and things that I'd like to do. So things like setting DB2 environment variables, shutting off health monitor, playing around with the configuration. Those are all scripts that I already have, and I tell you what to do. So I'm going to use some of those because I want to show you what happens once you change your container. So first thing I'm going to do is run this db2 set. It's going to say, you sure you want to do this? Yes. All right. And what are the other scripts? I want to shut off my health monitor. Sure you want to do this? Yes. It's going to go through and shut everything off. It's going to end up bouncing the database for me. And it's coming. There we go. What's next? I want to revoke public access. Yep, go ahead and do it. There we go. I want to go ahead and update the DBM. You want to proceed? Yes. It's going to have to bounce the instance to make sure everything takes effect, which you can see down here at the bottom. Perfect. And then the last script is I want to update my dbcfg with some preset values. And because I turn on log archiving, it's got to do a backup, which I throw to dev null, and it's done. All right, so I've done everything that I wanted here. My changes are all in effect, but how do I make it so I don't have to do this every time I come in? So I'm going to exit out of Docker. Docker ps -a. Here is my Docker container. that I have active up and running. And what I want to say, well, let me get my images too. Docker image list. So I'm going to say make a new image. And to do that, it's docker commit. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and give it the container ID. And then I need to give it basically a name or a repository or a tag. You see how I have this here, the repository and the tag? I think I'm just going to call it devc and 11.1. The other thing to note is this must be all lowercase or it won't work. Looks like it did something, right? So there we go. Now I have what I downloaded from the Docker store. Here is my manipulated image. I haven't started it, but here's my container. So what if you want to make two separate connections, like you want to simulate something? That's pretty easy. So let's call up the command we used to get in there. We're in, and just to show you, I'm going to make a connection. Db2 connect to sample, and then Db2 list applications. So I have an open connection with this window. If I want to do this again, what I can do is say, hey, create me another window, and let's go ahead and make that much larger for you. Docker ps-a. We still have our container there. Go ahead and create another creation, get back into the same machine. And if I did this right, when I do a list apps, I'm going to see the other connection still in play. Db2 list applications. There we go. So I have two open SSH connections, or the equivalent of SSH connections, to the same Docker container based off of an image I downloaded from the Docker store, and I went and manipulated it and created my own second image with my own customizations. Pretty easy, isn't it? Not complicated at all. Pull, run, execute. That's basically all you need to know to get an image up and running. And man, is that useful when you can spin something up just to bang on it or to do a proof of concept. And if you're in that DevOps world, this becomes very, very useful. I didn't cover everything. I showed you how to get an image and I showed you how to spin up a container, but I didn't show how to create a Docker file to make that image. We'll do that in another episode. But let me know what you thought. Did you get anything out of these two videos? Leave some comments below. And as always, subscribe so you can see what's coming up in the next few episodes.